Hello and welcome, everyone. Today is a very special episode as we are covering one of the most influential directors, possibly of all time. And I would probably aptly give him the name of the Russian Czar of cinema. And I am joined by a very special guest, and that is Guillermo, aka GDQ, who has published works on Film Cred and Taste of Cinema. Down below, there is going to be a link in which you can go through all of his works, find tremendous articles, and I actually found him through an article about Stalker, so it's very appropriate for us to now be talking about and Andrei Tarkovsky. This is awesome, and thank you guys for liking, subscribing, and commenting on this video. Guillermo, I saw on your letterbox, which I'm also going to link, that Tarkovsky is one of your favorite directors of all time. And what do you like so much, I guess, about Tarkovsky?
Hi, Taco. I'm doing great. Thank you for having me once again. I am pretty excited to be back and ready to dive into Andrei Tarkovsky. So, as to your question, for many years, the name Tarkovsky loomed over me, and knowing the adulation that unfolds his work to this day made me feel a bit intimidated going in. And all I've heard from him was that he had a reputation as a very forbidding, challenging, and cerebral genius. So I kept putting off his films for years and years in fear I wasn't ready, whatever that means. And in fear that his films would somehow go all over my head. In hindsight, I'm kicking myself for waiting so long, but on the other hand, I wouldn't have been so engrossed with his film if I'd seen it as a teenager. So Tarkovsky for me is a man with strong convictions, a deeply spiritual filmmaker who always favored contemplative introspection, and he was far more interested in examining the inner turmoil of his characters over any kind of conventional narrative. So it's true that not everyone tunes into Tarkovsky's wavelength immediately, and it took me a bit to fall in love with this kind of filmmaking, but I bought into him very quickly, and I think that his glacial pace, his long takes, they are somehow make you immerse yourself in his films. And whenever I watch a film from Tarkovsky, I feel fully transported. And it's the kind of films that you want to bathe in and immerse yourself and forget about any run times of looking at your phone. You just soak it in and absorb it.
I couldn't have said it better myself, and you brought up so many strong suits and elements that make Tarkovsky one of the best directors. And it is foreboding and it is intimidating because he is very unlike any director that I've seen so far. And I think a lot of directors possibly have been inspired by him, but what you said, the atmospheric and truly being drawn into the movie, I think we see really strongly in the two films that we're going to be covering and reviewing today. It's it's really truly unlike any experience in cinema, and for me to make you experience a medium rather that you're very familiar with in a different way is not something that is easy to do. The fact that he can do it says, I think, all that needs to be said about Andrei Tarkovsky, the director.
Yeah, you hit the nail right on the head when you say that there's a learning process to know how to digest Tarkovsky filmmaking. He's not one to really spill his beans and let you know every theme there is. He gives you the ingredients, but you have to do all the cooking.
Mm.
And I wondered, what was your first introduction to Tarkovsky? And how did you feel? Did you feel it was great? Was it a great experience, or?
So Tarkovsky was sort of along the lines of what you were you wanted to build up to it a little bit, but I think I probably dove in a little sooner than you did. I was starting into foreign cinema a lot more and started with Stalker, which is probably the most popular amongst his films, probably that or Solaris, and it was completely different than anything. And I definitely noticed his glacial pace, like you said. It's a very slow moving movie that takes its time, but there was just certain elements where the uniqueness of it really drew me in, and despite it, having a longer runtime, it was something that I was able to kind of latch onto. A lot of times with directors, especially ones that are so nuanced, it takes me a few movies to truly appreciate their craft. And that even goes for Tarkovsky, but I still love Stalker. But after seeing more of his films, and I eventually went to finish his filmography, I want to also go back to Stalker because I think my appreciation will only grow with a rewatch. How about you, Guillermo?
Yeah, I think you raise an interesting point in that Tarkovsky's films are can be great at first viewing, but they're layered enough to warrant very long repeated viewings without losing any mysticism.
Mm-hmm.
So I would definitely tell any viewer to stay off Stalker if you're a Tarkovsky newbie, because there can be quite a lot to chew on. But I do think that I started with Ivan's childhood. I
Mm.
remembered that was my first introduction to Tarkovsky. Someone told me to that the chronological order is the way to go, and in hindsight, I'd say that rings true with Tarkovsky. And even though with any given director, there's a certain appreciation to how their style evolves and how they hit their stride as a storyteller. But in Tarkovsky, I think that the having a few films under your belt can really enrich the experience of something in the likes of Stalker or Solaris or even his final film, The Sacrifice. So I appreciate having Ivan Childhood as a kind of stepping stone into his realm, and I immediately, after finishing his 7 films, I immediately bought his book, Sculpting in Time,
Mm.
which is a fascinating look into his whole thought process and philosophical ruminations. And I realized that the man is almost as good at articulating his thoughts on paper as he was on screen. So that's impressive.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I did see his book online, and I certainly think that's something that I would be interested in reading as well. And I think when you watch his movies, the dialogue, they make his characters make very profound points, and it comes off like almost one of the greats of writing in his script writing, to where I have to say, I it seems like he would lend himself perfectly to the written medium. So you saying that his book is great, it's not much of a surprise to me, just because of how how profound some of the statements his characters make. It's like poetry, some of his movies, and it's always introspective and very thought provoking. I would say every movie I've seen has that as one of its key elements.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty nice that you mentioned the poetic quality of his films, because as you may very well know, his father was a famous poet in Russia, and actually Tarkovsky featured some of his passages in Mirror, and so I think his literary upbringing really lends itself to leaks over all of his work. And I think that everyone who falls in love with his films would appreciate reading and picking up his brain a bit. And he certainly has a way of with words.
Oh yes, most definitely. Um, I would say, we covered Akira Kurosawa on our first episode, which you guys should check out because I think that was a great episode, great movies, and likened him to certain American directors. And I think your kind of breadth of what you've watched is a lot more expansive than me. As far as Tarkovsky goes, I can't quite think of anyone I've seen so far that is similar to him. He's a very unique beast to me, and I'm wondering, do you see any directors that you would kind of find match up very well with Tarkovsky and that they're kind of cut from the same cloth?
So, funnily enough, I can think of two who are both Americans, and they do have a similar way of storytelling that uses dream logic
Mm.
and a stream of vignettes and very introspective way of telling stories. Those would be David Lynch
Mm.
and Terrence Malick, more
Okay.
the latter than the former. And I think those two have scratched my Tarkovsky itch in the past few years, especially those films that forego any kind of straight-laced narrative, like Mulholland Drive or Tree of Life. I think you can trace both of those films back to, take for example, Mirror,
Mm.
and very autobiographical sentiment. And I think if I had to name two spiritual successors that are still working today, those two come to mind almost immediately.
Wow. Yeah, that's a really good point. And those are both directors that I want to explore their filmography more. And I think a big reason for that is because Tarkovsky's filmography is a lot shorter, you know, than others. And I'm sure you've heard about this, Guillermo. A lot of people think that his health complications did come while filming Stalker because I believe the lead actor and I think Andrei Tarkovsky's wife all kind of died from a similar type cancer, which they were, I guess, guessing or thinking were caused by, toxic chemicals that were on set during the filming of Stalker.
Yeah, so Stalker was initially filmed in an abandoned hydropower plant in Tallinn, Estonia, where an old factory dumped toxic chemicals. So, and although this is impossible to confirm, it is widely attributed to the as the most likely source of the cancer that would kill Tarkovsky himself, his wife, and Anatoly Solonitsyn, who is the main lead of Andrei Rublev, Stalker, and many other Tarkovsky features. So I think that premature death as a martyr and a political dissident adds to his stature and mysticism as this profound filmmaker who didn't shy away from risking his own life to get the job done. So perhaps that adds a more mysticism to his profile that other directors who had a long and very rich career like Bergman and Kurosawa don't have. I don't think if you agree with that.
I totally would, and I would like to kind of hear your take because you watched The Sacrifice, and that is his final film. Did you feel like there was any drop off, or was he kind of a director who went out while he was still at the top of his craft? Because that is not a very common thing that happens. I think maybe Kubrick is just one to name one who also went out at the top of their game. But would you say that for Tarkovsky as well?
Absolutely. So I think there's no such thing as a weak link in his filmography. And although I don't have The Sacrifice as my favorite film of his, I definitely think he had a lot to offer. And it is kind of heartbreaking to know that he had at least 20 to 30 years left in his career. And looking back, you can see now, for example, Martin Scorsese still going strong at plus 80 years. So
Mm.
you know that we could have easily gotten 5 to 6 extra films from this man had he not died prematurely. And for example, the Kubrick comparison, I think it's very apt
Mm.
because they both were geniuses in different ways, and they both had their own modus operandi. So he managed to never settle for anything less than his uh, best, and that goes to any of the 7 films he made.
Yeah. And I know another aspect of this, um, just from watching, there's actually a really cool series. It's on Shutter, which you wouldn't really expect much Tarkovsky um, media to be on there, but they have a cursed film series. They talk about Stalker, and you were kind of talking about his meticulous process. And in Stalker, it was really highlighted because he was seemingly doing the job of both director and cinematographer on that set. There was a lot of issues with the film and whatnot, but just kind of feeding into how meticulous he seemed, like, you know, the hardest worker on the set at all times, and wanted to really have the complete and final say and have his vision completely brought to life, which I think is something that is amazing to kind of put into your mind as a thought, because I think Stalker is one of the best, you know, views of cinematography and how it uses the setting, and everything is so brilliantly done. And to think that Tarkovsky's fingerprints are all over that, I think adds even more to his legacy.
Yeah. So I think that, for example, you take Stalker. I think outside of 2001, I cannot name a film that has pushed the boundaries of science fiction further than Stalker. And uh, every genre he tackled, he pushed the envelope and kept reinventing himself beyond the limits of what the audiences have grown to expect. And he controlled every aspect of filmmaking. He had his own troupe of actors. He had his own cinematographers. He also decided every frame of the film. So in that regard, he's like a Swiss Army knife of filmmaking in one hand. So I can only think of Kubrick or Kurosawa or Bergman as those kind of guys who went beyond the limits of what a director entails.
Absolutely. Guillermo, let's dive into our first film that we are going to cover for this episode. It is Andrei Rublev by Andrei Tarkovsky, 1966. And it's very much a kind of biography about the trials and tribulations of Andrei Rublev, who was an icon painter. So, and you might know more of the definition, but for me, I mean, this is kind of the kind of painter like we would see with the Sistine Chapel, where you would paint the religious paintings within a new church. Um, and we see his start kind of as his status grows, and then he goes on a vow of silence, and then in the end we kind of get this major conflict within Rublev, restored, for lack of a better term, or resolved rather. What were your initial thoughts on this one?
So yeah, although I was brought up as a Catholic, I've been an atheist for as long as I can remember. So on paper, the prospect of watching a 3-hour long black and white historical drama about a medieval icon painter didn't feel very enticing, to say the least. Fortunately, Andrei Rublev is just as much about religion, Russian historical identity, and the shift from Catholicism to paganism, as it is, in my opinion, a meditation on the meaning and importance of art.
Hmm.
And I want to go back to a certain quote that struck me while reading Tarkovsky's book, that pretty much defines his perception of what art and an artist's role mean in our society. It goes, an artist should not see his work as an act of self-gratification but of sacrifice, where the sincerity of his self-expression is the only pledge of his worth. And so Tarkovsky felt that every artist, such as himself, was a servant and had to, in a sense, pay back for the gift that had been given to them in their talent. And so he saw that art, if you're making an icon painter like Andrei Rublev, or a film or photograph or novel, it's an act of servitude that has its own postulate of faith, much like religion. So, in that regard, I think it's hard not to connect the dots between Andrei Rublev, the character, and Andrei Tarkovsky himself, who I'd say Rublev functions as a kind of stand in for the director in the story. If you take a look at them, you can see that both are artists with very an otherworldly talent who struggle to find inspiration for their work through the many hardships and the tragedy that torments them. And whereas Rublev in the movie finds his faith tested in an era of civil strife and foreign raids and destruction, and it's only by witnessing the work and relentless spirit of another younger artist in the Bellmaker at the end of the movie that he's ultimately encouraged to continue his work and eventually become quite one of the most memorable artists in Russian history. So if you compare that to Tarkovsky's own life, where he was a frequent target of Soviet censorship and struggled to get his films out in the open before actually deferring into the West. And he was living in a secular, despiritualized society in the Soviet Union. So it's funny how he tried to find the sacred and the sublime by finding refuge in the past, turning the clock back to simpler times, but also complicated times, where spirituality and the sacred were everywhere. And I don't know if you see that parallel between both the character and the creator.
Yeah, I think that Tarkovsky has and I wouldn't say unique, but as far as how strongly he's able to really insert himself as the spiritual kind of backing to his main characters are something that is really brilliant. It's almost as though he's leaving his blood within the character, and I found that very strongly here in Andrei Rublev, and that conflict of finding not meaning but inspiration is so strong, and like you said, it's this kind of not a trope, but it's a stereotype. It's this conflicted artist where you have a gift, and should your personal feelings kind of withhold you from sharing it, or are you almost, because you have this gift, you owe it to society to share it with the world? And that is such a it's a very thought-provoking idea. Um, Also, just one side tangent that I want to mention, and I had said this to you in discussion, but there are chapters to this. The second chapter starts with maybe my new favorite kind of sequence within cinema, and that is the raid. And I thought there's something about kind of large scale set pieces, and when they're able to be done well and almost to perfection as it is in this one, it's something to behold. uh, if you're watching this film, it starts slowly as most Tarkovsky films do, but let me tell you, there's a huge payoff. And then I think once it hits the raid, from there on out, it is just amazing cinema. To where I from that point on, I enjoyed this film so much. And that's not to say the beginning is lacking, but it just really hits high notes again and again and again. But I'm really glad you brought up that point. I totally did see Tarkovsky kind of almost commenting on himself through this film, which was strong and very powerful.
Yeah, and to the raid sequence, for my money, that is on my top 5 Tarkovsky sequences of all time, and it's ironic that the god of slow takes managed to make the one of the most breathtaking action sequences I've seen put on celluloid. So to anyone who thinks that Tarkovsky is a one trick pony, think twice. And there's so many mesmerizing sequences in this film. The camera just like drifts through the Russian landscape, and you see. You mentioned the raid scene, which is kind of the highlight of the film. But one that on rewatch uh, caught me off guard and stayed with me more than the first viewing was the St. John's Eve sequence where Andrei Rublev uh, finds a pagan ceremony, a ritual, and he's taken back. And he's mesmerized by what he's witnessing, which is beyond his beliefs and what was accepted in his society. And although this film is thoroughly a Catholic film, there's also like an elusive sensuality and mysticism to the occult and the what's out there that Tarkovsky manages to capture through the lens of Andrei Rublev, while he's having his faith tested, that speaks volumes to his capacity to weave through many passages and many different sequences without feeling dull or without feeling in one note. And Andrei Rublev, for me, is the whole pack of his arsenal as a filmmaker.
Yeah. And I kind of want to throw this question to you and see if you find any truth within it. I'm really glad you brought up the Pagans because it seemed to be that Tarkovsky was able to kind of flip the tables on it and show the prosecution of the pagans, ironically, by the kind of Catholic regime and putting it in the time period which this was filmed. And you had mentioned it earlier, Catholicism was all but outlawed in Russia to my historical knowledge. And do you think that was kind of a commentary or a modern commentary on how Catholicism was being treated in Russia during this time period?
I think that I could not have said it better, and I think that anti-Soviet manifesto applies to many films in his filmography. Stalker is also mentioned as a anti-Soviet parable, and Andrei Rublev definitely shows you how no matter what era you see yourself in, there's always a spin. We were all spokes on a wheel, and this one's on top, there one's on top, but it's always crushing people on the ground. And ironically, the violence and the persecution of the shown in the film actually rubbed the Soviet authorities the wrong way. And one aspect that happened in this film is that it was set to premiere at the Cannes Festival, but it was vetoed at the last minute because the Soviet authorities deemed it very anti-historical and too violent. And it was only screened 3 years later after heavy pressure from the French. And in the Soviet Union, the first showing was in 1971, if I recall correctly, in a completely unauthorized 100-minute long version, so almost a third of the entire runtime, that was completely butchered by the censorship. So I definitely think that the Soviet authorities saw themselves in the as the oppressors shown in the film, although the now in the Soviet Russia the coin was flipped, and it wasn't the Catholics but the atheists who were crushing everyone around on the ground.
And I think that is why I'm sure it has much more to do with how Tarkovsky's mind works, but I think the censorship led Tarkovsky to telling his narratives in such a way that it's very much reading between the lines and finding the symbolism and the themes behind everything with his stories. And I think he got used to doing this just because he was always kind of a director on the run, for lack of a better term, and not wanting to have his message squashed if it were to be so straightforward to where they could point to particular scenes and say, look, this is very clearly anti-Russia. And despite it happening this with this film, it's something you have to look at it from a historical perspective and also really kind of try to interpret yourself and then piece it together after you've finished it.
Yeah, and to be fair, Tarkovsky loved Russia as a nation and his roots, even while he was in his self-imposed exile. But there was this conflict of trying to pursue creative freedom in a oppressing state while still reminiscing your roots on the other side of the world. And to your point, I think that Andrei Rublev, for me, raises the question of what can persist in time. And the value of art in this case, are religious icons, paintings, and all of that stuff. But it also applies to film as a timeless relic of the past that can live on perpetually. And in the film, Andrei Rublev's art becomes a sort of beacon of hope that brings comfort to people in the face of despair. And I think that the film does hint at art as something that can elicit change in people, but that can also be corrupted if fallen in the wrong hands. And I mean, it's not the case with Tarkovsky, but I'm sure that many other of his peers and filmmakers in that era had no choice but to make propaganda films that they didn't condemn, but they had no choice but to make them. And I think that Tarkovsky knows that an art creation is only as good as what inspiration creates in people. So he knows that the path to enlightenment is very, very hard, as seen in this film, but the end result makes it all worth it. And the case in point would be to see the enduring legacy of any of his films, including Andrei Rublev.
I'm really glad you brought that up, and I kind of want to make a two-pronged point. The first one being one director that I really kind of fell in love with early on as I began to dive deeper into film was Werner Herzog, who also is an author, much like Andrei Tarkovsky, and he had kind of said that he believes, despite his large filmography, his works as both a documentarian and a feature film director, that the works of writing are going to be the ones that will pass on and kind of translate more as we go, hundreds of years after they're gone. Which is something that, and both you and I, someone who love film as a medium the most, I'd want to hear your perspective as to whether you think that will be the case for both Tarkovsky and Herzog, and that their writings are going to be the things that kind of transcend and come to define them after their films have, reached a certain age. And secondly, just kind of a point and kind of to see your perspective, because you being from Spain, me from America, we have more of a Western slant to our thinking, and for me, one of the most patriotic things you can do, no matter where your alliances lie, is to critique your country, their decisions, in hopes of improving the actions that they take. So I kind of wanted to know, to me, it ties into kind of the love and the nostalgia, not to be ironic, as that's the second film, of the country, to kind of critique it and say, look, this is an issue that we could improve to make this country better as a whole.
Yeah, I agree completely with your point, and I think that whenever a certain country has a lot of criticism on any art form, whether it's literature, film, or television, that's a healthy sign of a self-critical society that allows for opinion. And in some of my all-time favorite filmmakers have gone against the grain and criticize their own country, whether it's Robert Altman with his anti-establishment comedies in Hollywood, or all the way to Zhang Yimou back in China. So I think that film is always a great and a very accessible mean to translate to any given audience, whether it's you from America, whether it's me. I think everyone can relate to a film of this nature. And as to add to the point that you mentioned earlier about Herzog, Tarkovsky, and the timelessness of film, I have to mention that in his book, Tarkovsky is very critical of the state of film as a whole, and he thinks that back when he wrote it, that would be the early 80s, he considered cinema to be at an early stage compared to different art forms, older art forms like literature. And although he didn't think that his efforts were in vain and that the timelessness of his films would rub off within generations, he did think that there was a long way to go until film kind of caught up to the other art forms. And I do think that cinema has a added value that literature or other art forms don't have, is that you don't need to have an understanding of the knowledge, of the language, of the culture to absorb the images. And Tarkovsky is a great example of transmitting thousands of messages without any kind of dialogue. And so I would not agree with Herzog's statement that film has a expiry date. So, and Andrei Rublev is a telling point on that regard.
I I would have to agree with you because looking at this through the lens of nearly 60 years, and it does feel just as timeless. But I'm glad I brought it up because I think you made a really tremendous point that you brought up from Tarkovsky's literature, and that is just to look at, as far as the span of time in which cinema has existed. I mean, I think it was the late 1800s is when cinema was just in its infancy, and to look at how evolved the different how much it has evolved in such a short time span, and how we go from just frame, like the frame rate increasing, dialogue being added, color being added. And I think Tarkovsky was right because films now do look wildly different from Andrei Rublev, but that doesn't date it in a way that it's not to be appreciated anymore. I just
Right.
think that it that room for evolution can allow more things to be expressed. And I wonder what Tarkovsky, to harken back to a point we made earlier, would have been doing had he been able to create 6 or 7 more films had his life not ended so shortly.
Yeah, one thing that I can say without any hesitation is that Tarkovsky would be very disillusioned by the modern state of cinema as an art form. I think in the his book Sculpting in Time, he was already ranting about the mass consume um, structure of the industry. So I think that given the grim landscape of commercial cinema as a whole, I think he would be very pissed off if he was asked to comment on the current state of affairs. If we had a time traveling machine and we showed him Fast and Furious 12, I don't think he would be thrilled about the prospect.
Oh, yeah, I would have to agree with you on that. And it's rare now. I think even the true artists of our time right now have to concede to the kind of commercial and consumerism aspect to film. Otherwise, it's nearly impossible to exist and make your vision come to fruition. And I think as the pendulum always swings back and forth, that we are going to come upon a period in time within filmmaking to where the accessibility of supplies and what you need. I mean, I was talking about this on a past episode, how certain things that can add to your film are becoming cheaper and easier to find, that we might be on the precipice of a renaissance in which we have true artists able to make their vision come to fruition without kind of kneeling at the altar of consumerism. Do you think that that is on the horizon, Guillermo?
I do feel there's a lot to look forward to. I'm not sure if we will ever see a film of the likes of Apocalypse Now, Spartacus, where you had the pleasure of working with thousands and thousands of extras with the further technology of CGI. But I do think that there's a little bit of revisionist, rose-tinted nostalgia towards the past in terms of filmmaking, that we glance over the difficulties that even the masters of the past had to face. For example, Tarkovsky himself. And there's never been an easy time to make films without giving concessions, as you mentioned, in any point of history. And even if we look back to the 70s or the 50s as the golden age of the author and the director's showmanship, I think that if you look to the facts, you realize that the problems that we diagnose today as a problem inherent into the film industry already were there in the past decades. Only 1% of the films made it, so those have endured the test of time. So we look past very very fondly to the past decades. But yeah, I think to your point, there might be a chance for filmmakers to express themselves more easily and more freely than the past, with new technology and more access to education and films. The spread of internet and the Criterion Collection has made wonders to spread foreign films to Western audiences. So there's a lot to look forward to.
Absolutely. Let's transition to our next film by Andrei Tarkovsky, and that is Nostalgia, which was released in 1983. And I'm looking at this foreign poster, and I believe it is saying that Nostalgia won the 1983 jury prize. Is that correct? Do you happen to know that, Guillermo?
I think I do. I think he did won the jury prize, and I think that's the only win he's made at the Cannes festival.
Which is quite impressive. And this narrative, I think, is kind of nearing the more abstract. There's definitely a lot more straightforward points, and you had said this as well. Not as abstract as maybe Mir was, but not quite as straightforward as Andrei Rublev was. And would you like to give just a quick summation of what
Hmm.
Nostalgia is about?
All right, so a few pointers. This is the first film that Tarkovsky made after leaving Russia to escape censorship. So the film certainly reflects his own mood at the time by dealing with themes of homesickness, cultural alienation, creative freedom. And the story follows a melancholic Russian writer called Andrei Gorchakov, who travels across the Italian countryside along with a female interpreter to collect material on an 18th century composer who, despite his renowned fame, sunk into despair and committed suicide back home. So the main character finds himself in a state of profound alienation, both from the world and himself, stuck in a foreign landscape while constantly reminiscing about his past. And one thing that struck me the most after we visited the film for a second time is the many similarities I noticed between Tarkovsky's main characters. And much like the writer character in Stalker and Andrei Rublev, we find yet another disenchanted artist who seems to find no purpose in the world, ruled by materialism, and who desperately need to take a leap of faith of some kind. And during his retreat at a remote hot spring pool, he stumbles upon this eccentric man, this neighbor called Domenico, who has a lot of strong, if strange, convictions, and who begs him to cross through a mineral pool with a lighted candle, a seemingly absurd and illogical request that he claims will somehow bring the world together. And I noticed that fulfilling his dying wish ultimately brings Gorbachev and imbues him with a restored sense of purpose and meaning towards life. And this spiritual redemption of sorts falls in line with the one we discussed about Rublev's, and even Ryder back in the 1979 Stalker film. I don't know if you noticed that parallel between these pretty different films, but this redemption arc. I don't know if you noticed it upon
Yeah,
rewatch.
definitely the kind of this journey that by bringing the candle across this mineral deposited hot spring esque that was drained at the time swimming pool of sorts, and the journey to the zone, you can certainly see that these realizations and kind of profound conclusions about society are made by our main characters. And I feel like there's that same similarity between Andrei Rublev and Nostalgia, and that Tarkovsky is more so writing about himself through these main characters as well, which is a very nice tie in, too. Like you said, the kind of yearning for his homeland, while I think coming to a lot of conclusions as to the criticisms that he's making about his homeland at the same time. It's definitely a very complex story, and I think it tells them all very well. There's so much to read into. It's very thought provoking and poignant, but in a way that makes you have to really think about the points being made.
Yes, and to add to that point, nostalgia is very bleak at times,
Mhm.
but there's always a glimmer of hope that lets you get out of the film with a restored uh, confidence that there's something beyond our artificial needs that the Tarkovsky hints at. And although the film is very metaphysical and very complex, it never deals in platitudes. What I like most about Tarkovsky's way of expressing himself is that he kind of lets the audience fill in the gaps, and the what may feel like a bad thing for other viewers, I feel it's his biggest strength in that the esoteric and hermetic quality of his films actually play to their favor. And he gives you, like we said, like Lynch and Malick, he gives you all the ingredients, but lets you do all the cooking. And he provides a lot of insights, yes, but never in a way that comes off as condescending or heavy-handed, moralizing, like other lesser filmmakers tend to do.
Mm.
And to that point, I think that you always, no matter if you fall in love with his films or you just simply respect them, or even kind of feel bored, you always get out of them with a new perspective, a fresh perspective on life and the human condition, and that carries over to practically all seven of his feature length films.
I agree. I love the kind of analogy that you said about him giving you the ingredients, and I think it lends itself to the fact that you could have an audience full of people watching this, and I think the feelings and the beliefs that people would come out of it would be very individualized between the people watching it. And I'm not sure if that's something you agree on or not, too, but I think coming out of this film, you could have a multitude of different conclusions coming out of this. Would you agree?
Ab- Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say this about Tarkovsky. As someone like myself who watches quite a lot of films, it's a welcome sight when you find one that kind of stays with you far longer after the credits start rolling. And I noticed that I keep circling back to Tarkovsky weeks, months, even years later after watching his films, and they kind of live rent free in your head, and you chew them over throughout the time. I don't know if that's been your experience, but it has been mine for so far. And they, as we said earlier, they're layered enough to be as exciting in repeated viewings without any losing any kind of um, allure to them. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's the reason that this his work still resonates with young fellow viewers all across the globe, such as us, because he deals with universal and timeless themes that still feel urgent today. And I'll do say this about Nostalgia. I do agree with you that it is not his most action packed or more defined narrative. And it probably benefits from having a few of his films already under your belt before watching it. And definitely is best appreciated within the context of the director's personal struggle as a political dissident who is desperately longing for his homeland.
Yeah, I think, and without having seen all of his filmography, but from what I have seen, this seems to be the most politically cutting message that he has told yet, which is unsurprising considering he has fled Russia in, I would say, allowed him to very much look back at it, but also avoid censorship when critiquing the political state of Russia.
Yeah, definitely. And if you one of the things that I appreciate of watching his films chronologically is that you realize how his perception and worldview uh, grows bitter and soured into a certain cynicism compared to the early output of his films. That's not to say that his early films are happy and to be fair, Ivan's childhood, his first future is a bleak view of the horrors of the war and the human folly. So, in that regard, it is consistent throughout the years, but there's a hint of disillusionment that leaks into Nostalgia, arguably more than any other of his features.
So I want to start with and I might bring this back up at the end because I very much want to kind of hear your thoughts on this. He is, when you're looking for meaning throughout the entirety of any Tarkovsky film, right? And I think the title is something that plays really deeply into this film, something that you have to kind of look into. And Tarkovsky in this film is really able to make you feel this emotion, this concept in a way that very few directors are able to do. It's quite a unique experience. It's almost as though he's able to get you to look at nostalgia in a whole, have that feeling while kind of pointing out the shortcomings of this feeling that we have very positive emotions connected to. Um, and I want to kind of circle back to that at the end just to make sure that it comes up. But I have and I have to make an admission. I have to say, um, talking to you, it made me kind of look at a very particular scene in this film that I think maybe misinterpreted in a way, and that was the mission of taking the candle across the lake, which you kind of feel was a great revelation. And I actually had thought that this mission killed our main character because we hear him fall. And I was debating. I wasn't sure if he died or if he kind of just passed out when he fell. And I thought it was kind of a critique of living to get to a state in our minds that is kind of been painted with rose-colored glasses rather than living in the moment and having this real life experience that is painted, as we know, with both positives and negative emotions. So I think that is the beauty of Tarkovsky, though, in that you can interpret it in so many different ways and get so many different things out of it. And I guess I would like to kind of get your thoughts on both this interpretation that I have, which might have varied wildly from what you got out of it, and also his ability to, like in Mirror, he makes you feel like you're in a dream. And in Nostalgia, I think he captures that as well, where he can kind of make you feel like you're looking back at a nostalgic memory. So
Hmm.
I would love to hear your
S-
thoughts.
So you raised very good points, and to be fair, there's no wrong answers to this analysis. But I do think that the thing is the crossing the pool through with the lighted candle is irrational and illogical, and there's no real effect on that given ritual. And I do agree with you that the man eventually dies. I took it the same. I think that
Okay.
the Gorchakov dies after completing his ritual, but he dies with this newfound sense of purpose. And in reading the book of Sculpting in Time, Tarkovsky himself mentions that that he didn't write any heroes throughout his career, and no main character of his film is without flaws, and that goes to Gorchakov himself. And I tend to I allow that the film does view nostalgia as a dangerous drug that you cannot be stuck in the past indefinitely, and that can paralyze you from the present. I agree on that in that regard, but in terms of the catalyst to this new enlightenment of Gorchakov, I think that he awakes in a spiritual sense by realizing Domenico's conviction and selfless attitude and love for mankind. And we eventually see that Dominicus goes through his plan to kill himself in order to shed light into the ailments of society. But Tarkovsky refers to these certain characters, these fools, these holy fools of sorts, along with the Stalker from the Stalker movie, and the Bell creator of Andrei Rublev, as people who are idealists of some kind and who have such strong convictions that even though they go beyond reason to accomplish their goals, their effect can restore the faith in mankind for this disillusioned artist like Andrei Rublev, Gorchakov, and the writer and Stalker, that to give them a wake up call that was very much needed. So in that regard, him completing and going through with the lighted candle shows that in my opinion, that he's conviction has reawakened, and he has a new sense of direction, and he's kind of looked past his nostalgia and appreciate the moment, although ironically it is ultimately his end. He meets his end, but he meets his end in a way he feels accomplished in a way.
Yeah. Um, and you brought up one of the probably most intense scenes from a Tarkovsky movie I've seen yet, and that is the self-emulation of Dominico. And it was shocking in that that's just a shocking thing to see in any film, and also how true his words kind of rang as he was speaking out. And it's a very much a parallel between what we see with our main character and Domenico, the character that truly inspires him to actually follow a similar route. And it's just another thing that I love about Tarkovsky, because, like you said, there's a way to look at it where it's like they, as humans, transcend our form in going on this journey, walking this path, and trying to display this message, which is very much calling out to, I think, Russia and the world to bring back the morals that are needed to move ahead in society. But the illogical nature of these tasks in, breathing in these toxic fumes, and also self-emulation, kind of leads you to examine how they went about this message and whether it was the most beneficial way to get the message across.
Yeah, I agree with many points that you mentioned. I do not think that Domenico is said to be a flawless hero, and I don't think that Tarkovsky agrees with his methods.
Mm.
But I recall one certain quote of his film, of his book, that mentioned that the art and creative arts are the only way, along with faith, to reach what he referred to as an absolute truth. And I believe that he sees himself in a way as a man who goes to such lengths to get his vision out in the open, that he regards art, films, literature, and faith in anything, even if it's an illogical task such as Dominico's, as something that is a virtue, and that the modern man, as he called, is devoid of this conviction of faith and spirituality. And we have to look upon ourselves to restore it, no matter the end. So I think that might struck a chord with him, so that Dominic is the way he can translate his thoughts into these ailment of society that he recognizes nowadays, and brings him to back to the faith and art as the two tenets of humanity.
I want to try to. I want to bring up kind of 3 points, in which this can be a lot. So if you forget any of the points, let me know. But more or less, kind of cues for questions that I would like to pose to you. Um, there's a certain kind of breaking of logic that is found in Domenico. One of the biggest points, which is not something you so much see in Tarkovsky, or at least I haven't seen quite as clearly. There was something in the background. It was 1 + 1 = 1. Something also brought up as he was pouring oil in his hand. Like when you pour a drop and then a drop on top of it, you don't get two drops, you get one bigger drop, which is kind of something I would like to explore with you. And then another point was, it's almost kind of ironic that he brings it up. It was about how art can't be properly translated, which is, unique, and it speaks to me, and I'm sure it spoke to you too, because we're watching a foreign movie, and it might kind of play into the nationalism, and how he's removed himself from Russia, and maybe how that point might have trouble ringing true in the minds of his nation. And I guess the final point, and the biggest one, would be, as we talked about Rublev and this character being an illustration of the director himself, it feels like he is illustrating how he has taken kind of the final strike at what would allow him to go back to Russia. It's almost saying, this is the death of my life in Russia, because I would imagine he wouldn't be allowed back, or if so, he would be in prison for such cutting political commentary. And that mission that our lead character goes on illustrates the death of Tarkovsky as a Russian citizen, while trying to get the message across that he feels needs to be said. What do you think about any of those points made?
So, to your point about 1+1, I believe, and I took away the maybe the reason to that illogical summation, 1+1=1. I think it's a refusal to lock into and limit yourself to a logical understanding and perception of life.
Mm.
And this is funny because I just recently read Dostoevsky Notes from the Underground, and there's a similar monologue that I actually when I was reading it, I recalled Nostalgia, this film, that similarly goes against this thought and perception of mankind as a rational and logical human being. And to the point that there's referred in that particular scene, my take is that Dominico, or if you may, Tarkovsky himself, is refusing to allow to science and our rational reasoning to be our only perception of life itself. And I remember Stalker also treats this paradigm between science and art with certain characters, and he mentions that art and science are both in a way two valuable means of assimilating the world. And I remember that he described and compared art as a system of spheres that are each one perfect and contained within itself, while comparing science to an unending staircase. And I think that that comparison is pretty apt. And going back to your the sense of looking back to his homeland as as this character and as himself in that moment of time. One thing that he mentioned in the book was that Russian immigrants have a long history of adapting and struggling to adapt to their new countries and different ways of living. So through Korchakov's hardships, he wanted to reflect this essence of Russians as Russian identity as something that all immigrants long for, this sense of homesickness, that you will never adapt to your new reality. In the case of Tarkovsky, the fact that he left his family back at home and had to exile himself, in a way, this might have been therapeutic to make this kind of film in that stage of his life. but also, and as you mentioned, maybe he's coming to terms to the fact that for the rest of his life, he will spend it abroad. So I think that's an added layer that adds to Gorchakov's character. And to your third point, in terms of Rublev overcoming these obstacles and proving that there's a way to translate art and to overcome difficulties and with your art and use it as a beacon of hope that can persist in time. I think that Tarkovsky, in a way, agrees with that view. And the value of art for him, it's paradoxical that he mentions the untranslatable essence of art, but I think that some boils down to the essence of Russian identity as its own thing compared to Italian, European, Western culture that I think he tries to address by saying that everything for him feels alien and feels foreign, and that's for Russian art might feel foreign to everyone else.
Those are really, really great points that you made, Guillermo. And I want to ask you about these two films, if you had any final thoughts you would like to go into, and then about our personal rankings for Tarkovsky, the films in which we have seen.
All right, so yeah, Andrei Rublev for me is a high water mark in Tarkovsky's career, and both a solid distillation of his pet interests and artistic obsessions that basically run through his entire career. And I actually think that Andrei Rublev, despite its lengthy runtime, might be more accessible than Nostalgia. And the film flows so well, and it's actually pretty straightforward, going by Tarkovsky standards. And as such, I would recommend to watch Andrei Rublev first, if those are the only two options, and put off Nostalgia until you have a broader understanding of his kind of brand of filmmaking.
Absolutely, yeah. I would have to agree with that. And I think you would be able to get more out of Nostalgia after watching Rublev. And I would like to. One second, everybody. As I was saying, I think you would benefit from watching Rublev, and not to kind of get into the rankings too soon, but I have. Well, let me just ask you this prior to our rankings. Andre, it's so hard to say with Tarkovsky just because of how his work it kind of transcends in a lot of different ways, and each film does it so differently that it almost feels inappropriate to say this, but it almost feels like a magnum opus, which is ironic considering how early on it is within his career. But do you think that rings true whatsoever?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, much like we did with Kurosawa, Tarkovsky's a man who, as soon as you settle for a certain ranking of films, you begin to change it in your head. And I mean, you watch Andrei Rublev, and for any given filmmaker, that would be their crowning achievement, and they would gladly take it. And in terms of Tarkovsky, you could argue that any given film should be at the top spot. They definitely have a a good chance of being in anyone's ranking. So Rublev for me is astounding and very accomplished, even though it is his one of his early features. And I do agree that it feels sacrilegious to try to split hairs and put one on top of the other because they transcend um, the usual rankings of a lesser filmmaker.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Despite that, I would love to go into both your rankings and my rankings. You have seen all seven of Tarkovsky's feature length films, which I held off on after realizing that I had two more movies to watch as opposed to one. And I think it would make for a great additional episode in the future. But kind of looking at our rankings, we're pretty similar as far as everything goes. But I would love for you to kind of go into your rankings and explain, why you have yours in the order that you do.
I think you made the correct choice at putting off the your two remaining films, because the least thing you should do with when doing Tarkovsky is binge his whole work in a short span of time. I think every film should be given its own amount of time, and there's no weak link, as we said. So it pains me to put any film at the last spot, but rankings are rankings, so I'm not going to hold off. So kicking things off at the seventh, at the bottom position, I have The Sacrifice, which is his last film, filmed in Sweden, made a few months before his death, and it's a film that captures the fear of nuclear holocaust that clouded about Tarkovsky's head, and it is a poignant swan song, pretty worthy of his stature as a filmmaker. But however, this is the first and only time that I have personally felt the runtime in any Tarkovsky film. So that uh, puts the film down a notch below the others. At number 6, I have Tarkovsky's debut, Ivan's Childhood, which is kind of astounding to think that he broke out with such an accomplished film right out of the gate. And it didn't take too long for Tarkovsky to make his presence felt with a bleak portrait of the horrors of war, seen through the lens of a 12-year-old orphan spy called Ivan, who works as an informer for the Soviet forces. And the film sketches many themes and styles that would eventually become trademarks with what we think of when we think of Tarkovsky. So I do have to say that even though it doesn't crack my top 5, I do recommend watching it as an entry point for any viewers who are trying to dive into his work. So now we have to go to the top 5, and going at 5, I have Nostalgia. I don't know where it lands in your personal rankings.
For me, I have Nostalgia at 4.
The thing that Nostalgia might the thing that I don't appreciate about Nostalgia might be that it's not Tarkovsky at his own element. He mastered, for me, his truly great stretch of films were all in the Soviet Union. So I do appreciate the added perspective and the fresh perspective of doing it in the foreign soil, but I still contend that his stronger work all happened in the Soviet Union. So, as a cop-out of sorts, I have both Stalker and Mirror tied at the third and fourth position, and it's a game of inches. You ask me tomorrow, and I have one on top. You ask me today, and I have the other. And I do think that Stalker is definitely the quintessential Tarkovsky film, the one that you have to watch if you will only watch one film in your lifespan. I think you should watched Stalker, and it's a film that charts the depths of the human psyche, suggesting that perhaps our subconscious desires are not necessarily what we like to believe and should be better left unknown. And it's very thought provoking. And in terms of Mirror, I do think that it's the least accessible Tarkovsky feature overall. And it's the kind of film that is best approached leaving all kinds of rational reasoning out of the door and just watching in disbelief and let it soak in the atmosphere and in the imagery. And the film draws from Tarkovsky's personal childhood memories in essentially a stream of fragmented vignettes that bleed into each other. And although it may not be his most consistent film all throughout, it arguably is his most ambitious one for me.
I
And yeah,
completely agree.
so that leaves us with the top two spots. The second spot would go to Andrei Rublev, which we've picked apart plenty. And I would only say that if Ivan's Childhood was Tarkovsky's big breakout film, Rublev was a film that easily put him on the map and catapulted him to the upper pantheon of filmmakers in history. So that leaves us with my number one spot, which would go to Solaris, a complex examination of the power of memory, identity, and human consciousness that I think is still my favorite film and the one that truly rocked my world when I first watched it. But in any case, these rankings are far from set in stone, so take it with a grain of salt. But I would love to hear your personal rankings because they're you cannot go wrong with any.
Absolutely. And something that I have to preface with is, like you said, I think you can change these lists. This list is probably one of the most fluid, and there's definitely at least. I feel like it's a certain point I'm going to have to rewatch his full filmography once I've watched it all. But I start off, and this is one of the bigger differences because our lists are pretty similar, is I have Mirror at 5, and I feel like a large part of this was because I came into this movie completely blind, where literally just reading the summation of the movie after the fact left me looking at it like and able to finally piece it together. So I think watching that again would allow me to gain a better appreciation for it. But despite it being fifth out of 5 in my rankings, I feel like you said, the imagery and the way that it's able to do dreamlike sequences, it's pulling you into that atmosphere makes you feel like you're also experiencing a dream or a memory. And that is quite an accomplishment to do as a filmmaker. So
Mm.
something that it did tremendously well. Then I had Nostalgia, which we covered, and it's something where to be able, it's a great film to discuss, and all the kind of theories that you can put behind it makes it amazing, and that I really really liked it. So despite it being fourth, it's still a film that I absolutely love. Then I have Stalker. To me, as an introduction, for me to latch onto it without knowing a lot about Tarkovsky as a director, I think speaks to it greatly. And it's not the most accessible film, but there's so much there that you can appreciate, that I feel like now that I have a better understanding of Tarkovsky, I'm very much looking forward to rewatching that as well. And then my top two are your top two as well, but I have them reversed with Solaris second. As far as science fiction goes, I feel like this is a movie that cannot be overlooked as far as the masterpieces within science fiction. And just as a premise, it's such a unique and genius premise that I couldn't help but love it. And to have the internal conflict rooted in the premise makes it just an absolute must watch. And then one, I have Andrei Rublev because I feel like it's a magnum opus of sorts in the grand scale of what he was able to do, not only with just individual sequences, but in telling the life story of such a iconic character.
Definitely, and you spot on. You're spot on in terms of Solaris. I think that the it is kind of overblown, the comparisons with Kubrick's 2001, but I do believe that the Solaris stands toe to toe with any science fiction movie of all time. And it's, once again, every film looking back, it's all about the internal conflict of their characters. And I think that lends itself so great in such cerebral narratives that you cannot go wrong with any rankings, because they are all worth your attention, and very much worth an added repeated viewing.
Absolutely. And, possibly in the future, if you would be willing, Guillermo, we could do a Tarkovsky part two as I watch Ivan's childhood and the sacrifice. So if you would ever be up for
Yeah, yeah,
that,
yeah.
I think that would
And
make
that
it
would be, yeah, that would be great. A great follow up.
absolutely. Um, I want to say Guillermo writes for both Film Cred and Taste of Cinema, which he has a kind of a link that has all of his publications there, as well as his letterbox being down below, which I really encourage you all to check out, because if you liked what he had to say about these movies, you're going to love his writing and his letterbox as well. I love checking out your letterbox, and I love your writing too. It was definitely what drew me to kind of ask you to come on the channel, because you wrote so effortlessly about a very dense and complex movie and Stalker. And I want to ask you, just kind of before we close everything out, because you have such an extensive background in writing about film, what what are some of the things that you like about writing, and then what are some of the things that you like about being able to record and talk about these movies?
Yeah, to be fair, I'm a newbie of sorts in terms of recording, so I'm still learning, and I appreciate your guidance. But in terms of writing, I think for me, it most of all, I write for myself, and I think that should be the goal for any writer, including letterbox users, that you should write for yourself. And for me, at least, writing and chewing out films like of this nature allows me to articulate my thoughts and try to delve into the meaning behind this narrative. And for the most part, I use writing to allow myself to think about the films that I consume and not let it be a brainless hobby that I just binge watch the next film upon the next, to let every film that I watch breathe, even if it's a short one paragraph review on Letterboxd. And I think that for me has been therapeutic and has allowed me to articulate my thoughts. And of course, Tarkovsky is a very challenging to write about, but never boring and always thought provoking. So, although he's not everyone's cup of tea, and it may be easy for some to let their attention to wander, but for me, he's a master of his craft that made some of the most transcending and thought provoking films of all time. So he's a great subject to analyze, and I would very look forward to discuss it with you in a following podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to say, and this is a big shout out to you and to Matthew and to Ethan and to the Horror Rev, all the people that I record with. What makes it so awesome and what makes me absolutely love being able to do this is that talking to you guys allows me to look at the films that I enjoyed in a different way. And I think that's an opportunity that just it can't be overstated enough. It's a special thing to be able to talk about film. And Tarkovsky has created stuff that is tremendous for that. But being able to do this is it's so it's cool and it's awesome and I absolutely love it. And I want to thank all of you guys and Guillermo, I want to thank you because this was super cool to be able to do, and I'm glad we've been able to do it in the past, and I always look forward to doing it every episode. So just I want to thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for having me once again because I'm I look forward to our next collaboration, and it's a real pleasure to really delve into these all-time favorites of mine with someone who sees them from a fresh perspective. And so to close things off, if Tarkovsky could be distilled to a single message, I would like to mention this quote from the man himself that goes, "The meaning of existence lies above all in the fight against the evil within ourselves." And I think in one form or another, all of his films have made the point that we're not alone and abandoned in an empty universe. And there's always a way that can be found for one person to reach another. So I think that feels very liberating and uplifting. And yeah, it's been a blast to discuss Andrei Rublev and Nostalgia with you.
Yeah, awesome. I couldn't have ended it any better. Guillermo, thank you. I look forward to our next discussion. This one has been great. Thank you all for joining us. Be sure to like, subscribe, comment your thoughts or any movie recommendations, and also feel free, or I should say, I encourage you to check out Guillermo's work because it's all top notch, which I'm sure you had been able to tell throughout this discussion because this was an absolutely great one. Thank you again, Guillermo, and we will catch you on the flippity flute. Bye, y'all.